Crazy Stupid Podcast.
Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if this is your first time watching, we'd love it if you could hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell so that you are aware of when we post things.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Crazy Stupid Podcast. We're going to talk about House of the Dragon. We're going to be rewatching the show because the new season is going to start in a couple months.
June.
So we're talking about season 1, episode 1.
Yeah.
172 years before Daenerys.
It also just shows how popular Daenerys is as just a cultural character, because they're like, all right, if you need to remember anything else, 172 years before Daenerys Targaryen, and they literally removed the wording from that little paragraph.
Yeah. I guess in the end she was the central character in a way.
She's a bread and butter.
Yeah.
I think she's definitely more popular than Jon Snow.
Yeah, I mean, she probably is. I guess she just wasn't to me. I liked her.
I agree with you. She wasn't my favorite character, but from afar, I could see that was the draw
of the show.
Especially for casual fans.
Yeah. All right, so thoughts.
I guess one of the first things that I noticed, there's so much lore that they have to cover. I felt like they did as good enough job as they could. HBO's like, hey, you've got 10 episodes, have at it. Right. And that can be very constricting when there's so much lore. And so you have to try to fit in things that are important, things that will sort of highlight the ethos of the show. And so there are character dynamics and relationships that probably won't get as much time as it feels like you're getting when you're reading it. But in actuality, you're probably just getting one or two sentences that kind of tell you about the relationship. They did that multiple times in this first episode to give you an idea of things that are happening, and a lot of it was from camera work, right? You got a sense of during the battle, you got a sense of Alicent's anxiety because you see her doing this stuff with her nails, she's kind of picking at the scabs and her fingers are super red. You got glimpses of Rhaenyra and Rhaenyra where when she gets frightened, she grabs onto his arm. I think its name is Lord Beesbury. The camera cuts to him and then it seems like he's betting on Daemon. He's giving him some money, whatever. There were a lot of those moments where the characters who won't get as much screen time as the other people, they're using the camera work to sort of give you a glimpse of the dynamics that are happening for them as well. Rewatching it now and reading the books, it may not mean that much to the casual viewers, but to me it felt as a book reader, it's hey, we're acknowledging, yes, we know that there are these other things that are kind of existing. And there are some other examples that we'll get into in other episodes. We just don't have enough time to get at everything. But we'll do little winks and nods to kind of let you know that these things are, you know what I mean? So I found the camera work actually pretty impressive. Okay, this one is actually kind of funny, but I think it is what it is. And some of it is just the budget of the Game of Thrones show. They didn't have enough. When I watched this first episode and I saw how Viserys' tourney looked versus the tourney that Robert Baratheon had in season 1 of Game of Thrones, it's night and day. And I'm yo, Robert Baratheon was broke as hell. And I know they made an emphasis to show that he was in debt to the Lannisters. This episode, it felt so extravagant. They're in what feels like Colosseum-esque. There's so much more detail to the scenery, the separation between the two Javelancers. You're seeing all of the different flags that are hanging from these banners. The suits look so much better. You didn't really see any of that to that extent. In the hands tourney for Ned in season 1, it feels poor. And yeah, some of that is the budget constraints, but I feel it kind of adds to the narrative, because then there is a sense in season 1 where things have fallen off in King's Landing. These are not the good old days. In this episode, it kind of feels you're kind of in the good old days. And then you notice some other things, Daemon was extremely violent with the City Watch, but it still felt they were a respectable elite force that was kind of feared. I did not sense that in the first season of Game of Thrones. I'm not feeling elite when I'm watching the City Watch in the first season. I found that just sort of juxtaposing how things look now versus what they'll ultimately look like. They did a really good job of showing you how prestige a lot of these things felt in comparison to how things end up in the original show.
I'm sorry, I don't have much to add to that simply because I
don't remember.
remember.
That's fine. Yeah.
And to be fair, I was watching it before you were watching it. Like, I was only like 2 seasons late. When I was still in Minnesota, one time I was randomly downstairs and like late at night I would go on HBO to see what movies they were playing, because you know HBO and Stars on Saturday nights they used to put on movies.
And that's where you saw an episode?
And I turned it on, and I turned it on to the scene where Daenerys and her brother are like, she's like taking a bath.
What a way to be introduced to the show.
I'm not kidding. I literally was like, what the fuck is this? And I turned it off immediately. I was like, HBO? I was like, the second it clicked, I was like, that's her brother? I was like, no, thank you. I turned it off. And then a couple years later. So 2012 is when I started watching it. A lot of my notes were about the relationships between the people. First thing, I know that afterwards, I know that the showrunners confirmed that there is like a little bit of like romantic crush-like tension between Rhaenyra and Alicent. When they said that, I was like, oh, okay, cool. When I watched it again, I was like, oh, I see it. Like there's some moments where it's like
a little flirtatious.
Yeah, it's like it could be nothing, but like if you read a certain way, you're like, or see like the sort of lingering looks after some statements are made, I was like, oh, I definitely see this. Like when Rhaenyra lands and then she's talking to Alicent and Alicent's like, wow, it's grown so much bigger. And then Rhaenyra's like, yeah, soon there's gonna be room for 2. And Alicent's like, no thanks. And then the camera kind of pans back to Rhaenyra and you kind of see like a little bit of disappointment on her face. And then another time when they're studying and Alicent's like, you're not worried about your position, like she's talking about the new baby, and then Rhaenyra's like, I like this position, it's quite comfortable, and the position is that she's laying on her lap. But what I noticed is that it's always Rhaenyra who's making the comments, and Alicent is one that's kind of like, no.
Do you think there's a lack of interest, or maybe Alicent isn't comfortable in expressing
I don't think it's a lack of interest. I think that this is an early sign of the way that the two of them view rules. Because I think Rhaenyra has always been a person that's like, what I want is what I want, like rules be damned. So I feel like she's okay kind of like stepping into these waters and kind of feeling it out with Alicent. I think Alicent is like, no matter what we feel for each other, I'm not even willing to like test this out. I'm not even willing to see where this can go. This is just not a thing. That's how I read it. I didn't read it as a lack of interest. I read it more as like Alicent's gonna follow the rules. Yeah.
One of the things Game of Thrones does a really good job of, you learn about the feelings of a character by the dialogue of someone else. And sometimes they're saying it to you, like, you're not a person that would do X, Y, and Z. One example in game, you're not gonna remember this, but just bear with me. In Game of Thrones, when Stannis throws Davos into the dungeon, Stannis comes to Davos because Melisandre wants to burn Gendry alive. The way the conversation plays out, you get the sense that like Stannis is trying, like he wants Davos to convince him out of it, but he's never going to say it. Davos is the one that's like, you're not a man that's just going to slaughter a child for no particular reason. Blah, blah, blah. Like the show is using the dialogue that Davos is saying to give you probably insight on what Stannis is thinking. It's not like a book where you can read the inner thoughts of a character, and so it's just like a clever way that the dialogue sort of circumvents that a bit. That happened a few times. That one scene when Daemon's with I can't remember what her name is, but White Worm, as I guess her nickname, he's trying to like get it off, but like you can't really do it. Initially you're thinking like, all right, is he like impotent? Like what's wrong with this guy? And then she's the one that comes in and says, the king can't replace you. And then she starts naming his credentials about like, listen, you're wielding Dark Sister, you're writing Craxus, da 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 da. That again is going to give you like insight as to like the emotional state of Daemon, because you can't read his thoughts like you would in a book per se. You get a lot of complexities of who Daemon is just in that very first episode. They establish so much. You get the sense that he's very violent, a little impulsive. He can be a little murderous, right? And the way that he sort of handled things with the City Watch. But then you start to hear other things, like that scene where she's alluding to him like, you're going to be fine, your brother can't replace you, which gives you a sense of one of Daemon's probably insecurities is being replaced. He's a second son, so it's not like lineage is going to come easily for you to like sit on a throne. That doesn't really happen for second sons that much, which is a theme that showed up often in this first season. And then the argument that he has with Viserys at nearly the end of the episode, where it's like, yo, you keep sending me away, like to the Vale, to the City Watch. You get the sense of like, yo, it's been 10 years and you've never asked me to be your hand. Now, obviously, all of the other things that we just mentioned about Daemon makes it very difficult for anyone to be comfortable in naming him that. But it's showing you that this has been building up for him inside, and maybe he doesn't have the emotional intelligence and maturity to express it in the best way, but it humanizes him like quite a bit for me when I first watch it. There's the other moment where they're sort of alluding that Daemon might try to take Viserys out, and Viserys is like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Daemon would never do something like that. Daemon has like a lust for power, but he doesn't want the throne. And then you cut back to Daemon and he laughs. And I sort of took it as like, yeah, he's right. Like, he gets me. He was one of the more fleshed out people in that first episode, and I kind of appreciated that.
Yeah, I think they knew they had to flesh him out, because if you don't flesh him out, then he just becomes like a very one-dimensional villainous character that's not very interesting.
He's that complex in the books. Yeah.
I had similar thoughts about Daemon. I think Viserys is one of the people who gets him, but I think that he still is missing some things. I think Rhaenyra is the one person who truly understands him. I actually think that what Rhaenyra and Daemon bond over, their bond is based on the fact that they both sort of want the same thing, which is they really want to be seen and the approval of Viserys.
Yes.
And they're both longing for that. And so this new kid threatens them each in the same way.
Yeah.
In that it threatens to replace them, not even so much, I think, in terms of their succession to the throne, but in terms of their relationship to Viserys and the importance that they hold in his life. I think that when Viserys says, you guys don't know him, like he might be power hungry, but he doesn't want the throne, I even think that is a little bit of a misunderstanding, because I think that speech that Daemon gives Viserys at the end is not necessarily about wanting power. Partially it is, but I think mostly it's about, he wants Viserys' approval, and I don't think Viserys gets that.
Yeah.
I don't think Viserys sees that, like, what I'm asking for is for you to affirm me and validate me, and that you think I'm capable of doing these things.
Yeah.
And I don't think Viserys gets that, but Rhaenyra and him both have that like common understanding. You know, he's been so obsessed with this heir, and we're right here, and he's not leaning into us at all. He's not giving us any serious responsibility. He's not showing us that he believes in us in any serious way.
Yeah. And you get that with Daemon also in the finale, when he realizes that Viserys never told him about the dream that Aegon had. And again, Daemon reacts very impulsively, which I remember some fans being caught off guard by that. But I'm like, nah, that's the very reason that Viserys probably couldn't go fully on board with Daemon. He's very immature emotionally, and he acts very impulsively and very violent. And it's hard to ignore those things when you're trying to look for someone to help you rule. And it just makes his character in Daemon very messy and complicated. You know?
It's one of the things that him and Aemond have in common too, I think. That they're both just like deeply hurt people, but they express it in their brutality.
Yeah.
I'll get more on this later when talking about Viserys, but like in a way it was like a very emotional decision on his part.
Oh, for sure.
Part of his decision to choose Rhaenyra was that he wanted to hurt Daemon.
Because of what Daemon had just said.
Daemon had done. Rhaenyra being chosen as the successor to the throne could have easily caused Daemon to despise her.
Yeah.
And think of her as his enemy and competition. But it doesn't.
Not as badly as you probably would think.
Yeah.
There was some power struggle in that finale in the season, but it never got to the point where it was like, oh, this is dangerously concerning, where like he might try to like usurp her. It never got anything remotely close to that level.
Well, and also that's years later.
Yeah.
Like in the moment when it happens, like that, it doesn't become a point of tension between the two of them that I can recall, which is interesting to me, because even though he didn't want the throne, it was still a statement of how Viserys thinks of him.
Yeah.
That he would take such an unheard of step in choosing her as a successor instead of letting it go to him. You could see how Daemon might just, you know, I don't know, take that extremely personal, because honestly it is personal.
Sure.
And turn on Rhaenyra, but he doesn't.
Yeah.
And I feel like the only explanation for that is like sort of that bond that they had. I feel like he understands like, oh, you're in the same position as me. If I'm not getting what I wanted and needed, at least you are.
I also think Daemon, is attracted to power and status, but I think he only seeks after it for validation. I think that is probably the difference that you start to see in a lot of these scenes with him throughout the show so far.
And I don't think that's true for Rhaenyra.
I want to talk a little bit about Viserys. I noticed a few things that, again, one of the more fleshed out characters in this first episode. In the first scene, when he gets chosen,
He does not look happy.
he doesn't look happy. And he even looks across at Rhaenys and he's kind of giving her this look of like, I know, it should have been you. I know. And that gives you an idea of the conflict that he has and the opinions he probably holds about some of these structures and systems that are being upheld in their society. He doesn't strike me as a person that's like, I am fully on board with holding up patriarchy. I think he's one where he would have conversations philosophically, but he is not one to actually proactively try to break through those barriers.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. Like, is he, because could he have said no?
Well, I guess it depends on how you answer that question. I think he knew that would really destabilize the realm a bit. If like the king chooses you and then you turn it down, like it would get kind of messy. I don't know. It's all super creepy what I'm about to say, but like this is how the show went. Regardless of how you look at Viserys' decision in marrying Alicent, they were all for the wrong reasons. I think that was also part of it. Because if it was for like a political reason, like it sounds very nasty, but like he should have married Lena. And even Lord Strong tells him that later on, that would have been the better move to make. It just shows the humanity of his decision. I think he's coping. He was looking for comfort. I think he was backtracking because there is some idea of him trying to, he wants his dream to feel like it was real, that prophecy he had was legitimate, because that would probably make him feel better about the decision he made with Emma in that first episode. So I think there's a lot of things happening there with why he chooses Alicent. But I was going to say something about just that scene that he has with his wife when she's giving birth. Mm-hmm. You can see that he does not want to make this decision. This episode kind of showed you when you're trying to like uphold like systems that are oppressive for a group, the privileged group is also being harmed by it. And I felt like you kind of saw that play out with Viserys. Patriarchy is such an unnatural system because you have to do very questionable, almost absurd things to keep this structure in line, like what we saw he did with his wife. And they're only there to provide a son. Like their existence is not as valuable as what they can contribute to the patriarchy. Viserys knows that, and you can see him conflicted with it because he does not want to do that to his wife, but he's so obsessed with, I need to have a son, that he goes and does a very absurd thing. You can see he starts to wrestle with these ideas later on as the season goes on, because I think he finally met this moment of like, is this system even benefiting me as I was probably told it was going to? There's scenes later on in the season where he's like, I don't want to control Rhaenyra, I want her to be happy. Viserys goes to Corlys and Rhaenys about Rhaenyra marrying Laenor. Viserys also says something along the lines of like, whoever Rhaenyra's kids are, regardless of gender, like they're going to be the ones to take that throne. So to me, it was like a paradigm shift for him in what that happened. But it's like he learned the hard way of like, this obsession in this patriarchy is not just hurting women, like it's hurting you too. I felt the tragedy behind him realizing that.
I think you are correct. I have to say, I did not feel sympathy for Viserys in that scene, for the simple fact that you didn't have to make that choice. You could have asked her.
Yeah.
And that was the only right thing to do, frankly. You genuinely could have gone and you could have asked. I mean, we know the truth. Like, there wasn't a scenario where she lived. The maester told him, he was like, you can save one or lose them both. Like, those are your options.
Yeah.
So there's no scenario. It's not like he's choosing between his wife and his son.
Baby. Yeah,
there's no scenario where she lives. You could have asked her. You could have gone to her and you could have given her the agency in her last dying moments to decide how this ends for her. Frankly, there's a high chance that she would have said, do it because I want to give the baby a chance to live.
But you never would have known now.
And now you're living with the guilt because you refused to give her the chance to choose. I think you are right. I didn't feel bad for him. Sorry, you're an asshole for that.
Yeah.
You simply could have asked.
That's true. That's true.
I feel like a lot of people misunderstood that. I remember when we watched it here with some people coming over, there was like a lot of arguments about like, well, I mean, okay, it's then the baby dies and it's the issue at hand is here is the woman's agency.
Yeah.
That's the issue at hand. And that frankly is the issue at hand in this entire show.
Yes.
Is it's various women fighting for their agency in this system. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important way for them to start the story that all of this kicks off simply because a woman was not given the agency to choose in her final moments.
Yeah.
Because if he had given her that opportunity to make the decision, he doesn't get eaten up by guilt.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't go on and make all these impulsive decisions trying to backtrack and make up for all of this. And that's what causes this entire mess and puts all of these other women, Alicent, Rhaenyra, all these women in these situations.
Yeah.
They are trying to figure out, how do I maintain my own agency in this system where I'm really not being given much of any, particularly for Alicent. I think Rhaenyra is given a little bit more. Even with her, there's still
there's some limitations there.
The fight for the throne is honestly partially, I think, a fight for her to maintain that agency.
Yes, I'd agree. It was a pivot.
Honestly, that's really what I want to talk about Emma. She's just so important to this story.
Yes.
Even though she's not present for so much of it.
I put that thing, the ripple effect of what happens to her influences everything else. Everything in that show.
And I thought it was so genius, even though I can't watch it again. I fast forward it every time.
Yeah.
But I do think it was very genius how they mirrored what was happening to her to the brutality of
like the men in the tournament. Yeah.
Because I think that people think about the violence of that era as something that men primarily experience.
Yes.
And that's not true.
Yeah.
That's far from truth, because the positions that women were put into were often very violent in much different ways. And I think that this was one way to show that juxtaposition.
When she's in the bathtub and you start to see, she starts listing off the number of children she's lost. And I'm like, not even just the physical toll, the emotional toll that it probably took on her to have to experience all of that. But then also know that the realm is probably looking at you as a failure because you haven't lived up to your duty in maintaining that system, you know?
That's what she does, when she has that conversation with Rhaenyra and she's like, we have royal wombs and this is how we service the realm. Like, this is it. She was like, this is how we contribute to all of this. And so, yeah, I think she was of that mindset of like, this is my role in this. She told him, she was like, regardless of what happens after this, I'm done. Yeah.
And he seems to accept that. The show does a really good job of showing you the problems and trying to like make prophecy in your own image instead of knowing that, hey, this can play out in any possible way.
I also wonder if him accepting what Emma said had to do with him being so sure it was a male.
Yeah, I don't think it was like I'm going to give you what you want. I think it's like, all right, I won't argue with you, but like I already know it's going to be a guy, so we're good. Like,
yeah, because I think his obsession with that dream, you were giving birth and a male born with the crown, etc., etc. I don't think that obsession with that would have let her give up.
You think so?
No,
yeah.
He said okay because he thought we were done.
Fine.
Yeah.
I could see a situation where it's like the Abraham and Sarah story in the Bible where like he wanted a son so bad and then Abraham ends up sleeping with a concubine and then she has a son. I don't know if I would put it past Viserys to find other ways to have a child while still being married to Emma. I don't know. That obsession seemed like it completely consumed him. That's not going to go away.
Yeah.
It doesn't go away.
I don't think so.
The more you kind of watch House of the Dragon and read the books in A Song of Ice and Fire, you really get the sense of like the Targaryens really have some like real supremacist ideas about how they see themselves and how they see themselves interacting with the rest of Westeros, honestly. But the show kind of does a good job at showing you they're just as human as everyone else in a number of ways. And the books do an even better job of it in showing that reality. So one example, there's this idea of like, when you think of Targaryens, you think of them being able to control dragons. And that sort of feeds into this idea of them being closer to gods than men. But there were a lot of Targaryens who weren't able to control dragons. They tried to tame him. It does not work out well for them. So that already puts a little kink in whatever propaganda they kind of like to push out. There's some other ideas that I do wonder about, and a lot of this is up for question because you don't know how things are going to sort of end in the book. But when Viserys says to Rhaenyra about when the long night comes, we're going to have to be the one sitting on the throne to protect everyone. but that's actually not how it ended in the show. Now, granted, we all have feelings about the show. I understand that it ended kind of messily. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying if things end up similarly at that particular moment in the Long Night, even in the books, Jon and Daenerys, they're not close to even being on the Iron Throne. And in the show, they didn't have to be in order for everyone to win. But it still felt like Viserys interpreted these things of like, and not just Viserys, probably his father and people before him, we have to be the ones to save everyone. And it sort of fuels that very supremacist idea that they have about themselves. And a lot of it ties back into their origin. When they're in Valyria, they had a lot of slaves, and they had slaves doing very questionable things. One of the more interesting components is that doom of Valyria that they sort of talk a little bit about in the show. There are a lot of that point to slaves being the ones to start that, where they did things behind the scenes with some of the magic that the Valyrians were sort of dabbling in, and it caused whatever happened there. Even the free city of Braavos was founded by slaves that sort of escaped and revolted against people in Valyria. You get this idea, part of the history that's sort of there. They were already not great people. It should not surprise us that when they come to Westeros, even with there being some positive intention there with Aegon the Conqueror of knowing that the White Walkers are coming, they couldn't even consider a reality where things could have been a little bit more collaborative as opposed to them having to be the one to rule through everything. Because when they come to Westeros, I know that Aegon tries to do some things to show Westerosi culture that he's willing to sort of assimilate, but there were a lot of things that they were like not really trying to budge on. A lot of it was like marrying like your sisters and stuff like that. Like Westeros did not like that. They did not like it at all. But Targaryens had dragons. What can you do? You know what I mean? What can you do?
The only other thing I had was about Daemon. I think the show is very smart in what they choose to show us and what they choose to not show us. Because that scene in the brothel, we see glimpses, but we don't actually see the moment
when he says it. Yes.
We only hear Hightower's interpretation of it via his little spies that he has.
And maybe some bias kicking in of how he wanted to hear these reports.
Or maybe some intentional manipulation. Everybody else there is definitely celebrating. But Daemon was not celebrating.
He wasn't.
He was not celebrating. He looked very upset. And when he gets up to make the speech, he looks solemn. He does not look like he's about to give a rousing celebratory speech to hype everybody up. And so I can see a world in which he says the heir for a day as a means to honor him.
Yeah.
It is all dependent on the tone and context in which he said it, and they intentionally didn't give us that, which I think was a masterful choice on the part of the showrunners.
But what's also I thought was very interesting in that scene is the conclusion that you come to has to be based on what you were able to see, and everything leading up until the scene cuts to Otto and Viserys should tell you Daemon wasn't celebrating. And that can give you, in my opinion, and I'm open to being wrong, that to me was like the showrunners telling you, hey, even if we didn't show it and you're hearing it from Otto's perspective, but you know that Otto doesn't like Daemon, what did we just see Daemon doing though?
Well, you see, I think it can go one of either two ways, and both I think are equally plausible. I think it is a fact that we know based off what they've showed us that Daemon is not there to celebrate, that he genuinely mourns what happened to Emma. So he genuinely mourns that. We know that because we see him at the funeral and we see him in the brothel. But there is a world in which, because of the persona he puts on for his men,
and they were kind of hyping him up a bit,
that he gets up there and he gives them what they want.
Yes.
That's possible that he did it. We would know he didn't mean it, but it doesn't really take away from the sting and the fact that he did it. I think it's equally possible, either one of them. I think we intentionally don't know, because in the end it doesn't matter, frankly, because what matters is how was it interpreted to Viserys.
Overall, when we first watched it, you said that you liked this first season more than Game of Thrones first season. After watching this first episode, do you still feel the same way?
Yeah, I still feel the same way because the reasons are still true. I think that I like the fact that the politics in the show are based in relationship. as the show goes on in Game of Thrones and they tell you some of the backstory of what happened leading up to everything, you learn that there was a lot of like relational things happening. But for the bulk of that first season, it's a lot of politics, and it's a lot of like, honestly, when I watched the show the first time through, I don't think I really knew what was going on a lot of
Game of Thrones?
Yeah, I don't think I knew as good. Because it was a lot, like you really had to listen to what people were saying and be like, oh, this is what this is this person's motives, and that's what that person has at play here, and that's what da-da-da. And I think that's good. I think it was masterful storytelling, and sure. I am not knocking that at all. But I enjoy the fact that the politics in this show are simple, but it's the relationships that are complicated.
Yeah.
And I like that better.
All right, y'all. And with that, we want to thank you all again, and we will see you all next time. Peace out, everyone.